Okay, so I'll be talking about some of the considerations and challenges involved in setting up a monitoring program to assess the effectiveness of restoration on woodland birds in the northern and eastern parts of the Mount Lofty Ranges. Whoops, no, I've done it already. There we go. Ooh. It's, yeah, down is doing that.
Do you want to just use the space bar?
Yeah. All right. So this all started with the landscape assessment process for the region that was conducted a few years ago, that involved splitting up the region into ecosystem groups, and then looking at the species, the bird species that were characteristic of each of those groups, and then determining the status of those species and whether they were declining, increasing or stable in terms of setting up priorities for restoration. And that process identified grassy woodland ecosystems, seen in yellow there on the map, and 7 declining woodland bird species associated with these systems as a priority for restoration. And so following that process, a whole heap of restoration has been conducted, mainly as part of the Paddock Tree Project with Trees for Life, and that's been done at low densities in grazing landscapes, which is typical of the areas where these species are found, and also in the eastern rather than the eastern and the northern rather than the western parts of the ranges, where some of these species have disappeared entirely already. So the aim of this monitoring was to determine the success of this restoration at providing a habitat and arresting declines of these woodland birds, and by comparing their status now at the beginning of the plantings to that in future when the habitat is mature, so that it can give us some feedback on whether it has worked and whether anything needs to change for any future restoration for these species. So the first part of the monitoring design that was considered was the scale and setting. And there has already been some bird monitoring in relation to restoration in grassy ecosystem sites in the region at a few specific sites, like at Para Woodland near Gawler, and at Franz Farm at Minato, and at the mine at Kanmantoo. And this is going to give us some really good information about the use of these single sites in relation to the use by individuals of these bird species. But what we wanted to know is how the restoration was impacting on the population. So we needed more of a population, a broader scale, to infer something about the populations in the region. And there has already been a whole heap of general bird monitoring done at a really good spatial scale in the region, spanning much of the length of the region, but this has been done majorly in the higher rainfall, denser woodlands, and not the grassy woodlands we're considering in the lower slopes and plains where these species are found, and also where the restoration is actually happening. So we needed a program that was not only broad in its extent, but was in the core habitat of the species concerned. And within that core habitat, given that we were interested in the populations, landscape level sampling was conducted across both remnant and revegetated sites, rather than to give us an idea of how these birds were tracking across the whole landscape in existing habitat as well as the new habitat in the plantings. The next major component that we considered was how many sites and visits to sites would be needed, or surveys, repeat surveys to sites would be needed. And this is usually done subjectively, and typically for birds is just a standard 3-visit protocol, and then the number of sites that are surveyed are usually just a number that can be visited 3 times within the available effort. But rather than stabbing in the dark like this, we actually wanted to know what the chance was of detecting change with a given site visit regime. So to do this, occupancy models were used with existing data, existing 2 hectare 20-minute data sourced from BirdLife Australia, to give us a detectability and occupancy estimates for each of the species. And these estimates can generally provide you with some information about how many sites and visits are required, with lower occupancy species generally needing more sites, and lower detectability species generally needing more visits, and those with both low occupancy and detection needing more sites and visits. So these are the detection and occupancy estimates plotted for each of the 7 species. And as you can see, most of them are sitting in the low occupancy detection part of the plot, which means more effort. And only Jackie Winters and brown tree creepers have relatively high detectability, and brown tree creepers relatively higher occupancy. So these estimates can be combined with general guidelines in line with this plot to give you an idea of how many sites and visits you should undertake in order to minimise the variance around your occupancy estimates and enhance the detection of these species. But we actually wanted to know what the chance was of a change of a certain magnitude. So that required power analysis. So using those estimates from the existing data, this is the power achievable at different site visit regimes in relation to detecting a 30% increase. And this is, sorry, I should say that the power levels are shown in the blue lines going up in 10% intervals, and the dashed red line is the total amount of survey effort that's achievable, with anything under that being feasible. And so this is telling us 2 things. One, that 3 of the species, chestnut rump thornbill, Jackie Winter and restless flycatcher, have virtually no chance of detecting change at with these methods at a 30% increase. And only one of the species gets close to the generally accepted power level of 0.8, the brown tree creeper, which is rather worrying because that survey effort represents nearly 100 days sampling in the field. And also given that 30% increase is rather large as well. The other thing this is telling us, though, is that the optimal design for these most of these species is at 4 visits rather than the conventional 3 visits, at least for those with some power. You can see that, except for Jackie Winters and brown tree creepers, which have lower visits for their optimum, which makes sense because they were the more detectable species. But clearly just using the optimal site and visit combination was not going to be enough, given especially for the 3 species with really low power. So other methods had to be considered. And after evaluating the feasibility of a whole range of different methods, we opted for a combined survey and opportunistic data design where the survey data was complemented with opportunistic data. They're shown in blue around the survey sites, in red being collected en route to sites, so not actually adding to the survey effort. And this also allowed for all data to be included from the surveys as well, which is quite important because these species are often detected in surveys but outside of the plots or outside of the time. And so to deal with the unstandardised nature of the opportunistic data, list length, or the number of species in a visit, was used to standardise the effort as a covariate for the detection in occupancy models. And that was because it's been shown to broadly correlate with search effort. And so this meant analysing the data will mean analysing the data in grid cells rather than specific sites per se, which does help also increase the power in terms of adding extra data points to the models, because you're going to get opportunistic records away from the survey sites and adding extra grid cells. And what this approach also allows is adding additional opportunistic data collected from other projects around the time of the plantings to be included, and this is just some of the data. There will be more as well, and that helps increase the number of sites and number of records even more. So this is nowhere near a perfect approach, but one that hopefully will help us maximise the chance of detecting any change in relation to the restoration. Also, hopefully this talk highlights some of the challenges involved in setting up an effective monitoring program, and reinforces the need to be highly strategic in your design in terms of maximising the chance of detection as much as possible with the resources available. Thank you.